We're so grateful. We are shifting to an opportunity to reimagine how we can transform our criminal legal system. The United States is the prison capital of the world, incarcerating over 2.3 million people in this country. We have seen over the course of the past year protests and demonstrations of nonviolent direct action calling for a reimagining of our carceral system. That we know that this is something that the Trotter Collaborative has been dedicated to, particularly in this last year, as we worked with mayors in Birmingham and Somerville, Massachusetts, and in Albany, New York, to work with these administrations and work with these communities to reimagine public safety and make sure that the citizen's voice is at the center of what we need to create an equitable world for all. So I'm excited that at this moment, we are honored to have none other than Letitia James, the 67th Attorney General of the state of New York, who will come and offer an introduction to our criminal legal system transformation panel. We are extremely delighted and honored to have Attorney General James with us. It's so great to see you, General.
It's nice to see you as well. Thank you, Professor Crawford, and thank you for that gracious introduction. And to the Kennedy School for inviting me here today. It is an honor to be with all of the scholars, the activists, and organizations here as we explore some of our nation's most pressing problems. For many of us as advocates, as legal experts, and especially as concerned and engaged community members, the state of our criminal justice system is broken, and it has provided a particular sense of pain and frustration amongst communities of color. And while those feelings have simmered for years over the past year, they have ignited calls for change, which have reached a fever pitch. We are in the midst of racial reckoning in this nation. As you know, earlier this year, my office filed a lawsuit against members of the New York City Police Department for its widespread use of excessive force against protesters in New York in the aftermath of the George Floyd protest. The very thing being protested, aggressive actions of law enforcement, was on brutal and public display. These incidents and many more like them have rightfully challenged public confidence in our law enforcement and trust within a system that is desperately in need of reform. Just a few minutes ago, I announced legislation along with my colleagues in the state and in the assembly, legislation that would amend New York's use of force laws and to ensure that individuals who we trust with enforcing the law, they should be held accountable for breaking them, for violating the rights of individuals, for actually killing individuals in the state of New York. As you know, similar reforms have been introduced in New Jersey, in the state of Washington, and in municipalities in California. And while it is a critical step forward in New York, it is clear we need more action. And we need action statewide and we need action nationwide, which is why I would hope that Congress, and particularly the United States Senate, pass the George Floyd Policing Act, which would give attorneys general more authority to engage in pattern and practices all across this nation. And in addition to that, it would provide much needed reforms to law enforcement as well as to a criminal justice system. And this expert panel will help discuss exactly what action is needed. It is an honor to introduce our panelists here today, Professor Ron Sullivan Jr., Professor Yanilda González, and Sara Sidner, who are all at the forefront of the battle for criminal justice reform in this country. Professor Ron Sullivan, a fellow attorney who has earned himself the title, the man who dealt the biggest blow to mass incarceration by winning the release of the most incarcerated persons than anyone else in the United States history. He has really walked the walk and not just talked the talk and continued to speak truth to power. Professor Yanilda María González is an assistant professor of public policy here at the Kennedy School, and her work focuses on how race and other demographics affect policing, state violence, and the citizenship process in democracies. Her work, not just in the United States, but also in Latin America, particularly Argentina, adds a lens that will help to broaden our perspective. And finally, an award-winning journalist, Sara Sidner, a national and international correspondent with CNN, who has been on the ground covering many of the police reform protests across the nation in the past few years. Over the past year, she provided critical insight for millions of Americans following the death of George Floyd. And she was our eyes and ears on the ground in Minneapolis in the months that followed during the Chauvin trial. And at this point in time, I really want to give a shout out to my colleague and friend, the Attorney General Keith Ellison, who presided over that trial and who was successful in getting a conviction. And last but not least, Professor Sandra Susan Smith, who will be moderating this panel and facilitating this discussion about abolishing the carceral state and building the nation. Professor Smith is the Daniel and Florence Guggenheim Professor of Criminal Justice and Faculty Director of the Program in Criminal Justice Policy and Management. She's also the Carol K. Porheimer Professor at the Radcliffe Institute. Professor Smith has committed her career to exploring the institutional and societal factors that have prevented Black communities from gaining employment and economic mobility, and more recently, the ways in which the criminal justice system is inextricably linked to these issues in our understanding of the economy as a whole. This is an extraordinary panel that Professor Brooks has put together to discuss the challenges we face and how we can and must work together to begin to untangle them. Thank you all for being here. And with that, I'll hand it over to Professor Smith so we can get started. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Attorney General James, for that brilliant welcome. We know that you are an extraordinarily busy woman, so we thank you for the history, groundbreaking work you are doing in New York, in the state of New York. And with that, we will hasten to our panel. Our moderator is none other than Dr. Sandra Susan Smith, professor at the Harvard Kennedy School and director of the Program in Criminal Justice Policy and Management. We are so grateful to have Dr. Smith with us today. It's so great to see you.
It's great to be here, Devin. Thank you so much for this warm welcome. Thank you, Attorney General James, for just an amazing introduction. It is a pleasure and an honor to be on the same virtual stage with you. So let's kick this off. This is how we're imagining today's panel. I will ask each of our panelists one question or two questions that they all will be asked to address. And then I will ask each of them 1 to 2 questions before we turn it over for Q&A with the audience. So let us begin with the first question that I have, and one that I imagine many will anticipate. We are just days away from the 1-year anniversary of George Floyd's murder. Since then, over 180 Black men have been killed by police. 1 month ago, Derek Chauvin was convicted of murdering Floyd. It has been estimated that more than 100 people were killed by police across the U.S. during the 3 weeks of Chauvin's trial. What are we to make of this? What concerns should we have? Where are the points for hope? Can we start with Sara Sidner? It's good to meet you.
Sandra, thank you so much. And it's an honor to be on this panel with you and Ron and Yanilda. You know, I am a reporter and I am not used to having the first question be about hope. I have to say it's usually a little more negative and a little more dark than that, but I am really happy that you asked it that way and that we start on a high note. There is an extraordinary amount of hope coupled with skepticism, if you will, because people for the first time in our history, in our recent history, because the 60s happened and we all saw that. Some of us saw that on video. Some of us heard that through our families, heard about what they did, what King did, what all of the people who we all know in the history books have done. This is another iteration of that. This is another civil rights movement, or a continuation, if you will, of one that I think a lot of young people felt that those folks in the 60s that were able to make some change, that they put the mantle down, they dropped the mantle for too long. And I hear that over and over and over again. It's like, yes, we recognize what you did, but we needed for it to go further and people got comfortable. And so the hope that I think that we have seen in a real visceral way is to see as many white folks and folks of Asian descent and Latinx folks outstanding beside Black folks right after George Floyd was murdered, to see those swells of people, not just in Minneapolis, not just in New York, not just in Los Angeles, but across the entire nation, the Midwest included, and then to see that spill over into the world, Germany and London and Paris. I think that was a moment where people felt that solidarity was real, that people were taking chances with their own lives, that they were willing to put their faces and names on the Black Lives Matter movement to say, this has to change. We will not stand for this anymore. And I think that has given people a great deal of hope to see the numbers of people of different ethnicities and socioeconomic backgrounds and colors and creeds come out and stand side by side with them to say, no, we have to do something different. This isn't working. So I think that is one of the things. And the second thing is policy. Mm-hmm. There is a real movement on the ground that people realize, many realize, that protest may come first because that is the visceral reaction to sorrow, heartbreak, frustration, rage, but that there has to be a change in policy. And people are starting to speak out about that, including at times police officers themselves. We heard from the chief of police in Minneapolis. He was unshakable in his belief that change had to happen, that he was already trying to implement change before this happened. So you are seeing something where people are pushing policy forward because they know that protests can work for a time, but if you want to put something down on paper and change behaviors over time, there has to be something that is in the law. And that's where I'll end it.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I really appreciate that. I would like to follow up with you, though, on giving your response. And this is not to move from somewhat positive to a more negative.
I'm used to it.
Yeah, okay, good. So recent polls suggest that just 25% of white Americans think that Blacks get treated worse than whites by the police. Just 25%. So over the summer, we knew that those rates were much higher. Roughly 67% of Blacks believe that Black people get treated worse by the police than whites. And so there seems to be, after this moment of incredible, like, coming together, collective outcry about police brutality, that there's been a decline, a significant decline among white Americans in that feeling, in that sense. What do we make of this? And is there something positive to take out of what seems to be kind of a pessimistic turn?
If we look at history, there is always the correction, if you will, where people immediately react because they see something that they know is wrong, that there is just unmistakably wrong, that appeared as torture in front of their eyes that they could not deny. And then you start getting the blowback. I can't mention a Black person in my family or life who does not expect there to be a push back from this. But I will counter with saying a brand new poll just came out, literally, this is breaking news, 5 to 7 minutes ago, that CNN went and asked about policing in America. And I'll throw this number at you. 45% of American adults say that police violence against the public is very or extremely serious and a problem. And about half of Americans, 51%, say that police who cause injury or death are treated too leniently by the criminal justice system. Those are big numbers. Those numbers indicate that change is possible. But I hear you on the fact that people do jump in. They jumped in with all of their hearts at the beginning, and then they start hearing pushback. Then they start hearing all of the sort of talking heads and their families and the reaction, and they start feeling bad sometimes, white folks in America, about what has transpired. And then they start thinking, well, this isn't I didn't do this to anyone. Like, why are people attacking, me? And so I think you always have this reaction where people jump in and then they pull back and say, like, wait a minute, no, it's not that bad, because it's not their lived experience. So it is one of those things where the drumbeat continues, but we are going to expect there to be some sort of backlash. It happens every single time. I still say that even 25% was probably higher than before George Floyd was killed.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Ron, would you like to jump in and share your thoughts on this? What are we to make of this moment, 1 year after George Floyd's murder, a month after Derek Chauvin's conviction? Where are we now? What should we be hopeful about? What should we be concerned about? You're muted, I believe.
My apologies. So thanks for having me. What should we make of this moment, given the data that you gave us? 181, I believe, was the number, blacks who were injured by police. So I think what we should make of it is that the George Floyd conviction was the beginning, but not the end. That is to say that it was a great victory. It held a particular police officer accountable, and in that sense, provided a lot of joy to the family and to many across the country. But it's certainly not the end. There's much more to do. We see that the problem is much more systemic than located in one little district in Minneapolis, and that this one case in and of itself is not going to change everything. What is hopeful is the fact that there was a conviction. We know history teaches us that it's rare, and indeed, up through the jury deliberating, I predicted that there would be some compromise verdict, and perhaps he would be convicted of negligent homicide. I was shocked that he was convicted of all 3 counts. What I think this shows is that, and will provide hope, is that it is possible to hold police officers accountable, that we now live, I hope and pray, in a political economy where jurors will indeed hold police officers accountable for their misdeeds. And that works as a general deterrent for other police officers. That is, it will incentivize them to engage in good behavior or disincentivize them from behaving in bad behavior, because they see, geez, this guy got convicted. I don't want to be convicted, so I'm going to behave better. I think that's the silver lining. That's the thing that we have to hope for. Now, we shouldn't think that the George Floyd conviction is going to sort of overdetermine results around the country, because if we think about it, it took an extraordinary confluence of circumstances to get that guy convicted. I mean, for goodness sakes, it was on videotape. The whole thing, like 10 minutes on videotape, and that just doesn't happen everywhere and all over the place. So we have to keep that in mind. But it's a really, really good start, and I hope it continues in the future. The second question I had to do with why do I think that maybe only 25% of Americans think that blacks are treated badly? I think it has everything.
White Americans.
I'm sorry. White Americans think that blacks are treated disparately by police officers. We know how we're treated, so that's I suspect that number would shoot way up. And I think it has to do with the story of America, the mythology of America that underwrites our nation. America is, as you know, as much an idea as it is a place. And every country has an idea about itself, has a mythology that it expresses about itself. And it's inconsistent with the idea of America that so many of its citizens are treated differently. And I think that because of that, many in the white community have a complete blind spot to data that show something very different.
Well, I really appreciate your responses. I'm going to follow up with two questions for you, Ron. One is, are these questions, they might be statements and you can just respond. So in 2009, Oscar Grant was killed by Johannes Messerly. About, I think, maybe 2 years later or so maybe 10 years ago, he was convicted of that death. I can't remember exactly what charges he was convicted on, and he was sent to prison. Around that time, people also said what you were saying today, which this is just the beginning. We're going to make progress from there, but we finally have a conviction. This is so rare. It rarely happens. This means that we are making progress. 10 years later, I don't know how many Black and Latino men and women have been killed at the hands of police. And it feels like deja vu in a way. So one, I want you to speak to that. But after I make this other point, you say that the Chauvin case shows that it is possible to hold police officers accountable for misdeeds. My question is this really about specific police officers? And I ask this for this reason. In Minneapolis, police officers are 8 times more likely to engage with Black people relative to whites with use of force, violently, right? Despite the fact that Black people only make up, I think it's 20, maybe 25%, 60% of use of force cases are with Black people. This is across the city. The Minneapolis Police Department had multiple complaints against Chauvin and basically did nothing in response to these. He was never really sanctioned for any of the number of complaints that were made. And then when George Floyd was when he was killed, initially the reports came out by the police department that somehow George Floyd just happened to have a medical incident that led to his death. The Minneapolis Police Department attempted to cover up this murder, right? Is this truly about holding individual police officers accountable, or is this about holding the institution, police agencies accountable, of which these police officers are embedded? And it is through these institutions that they're able to continue to engage in these misdeeds, but it would not happen without the institution. Could you speak to me about those 2 points?
Yeah, so to the first point, I'll give the best argument. So I'm not a raging optimist on these things, probably because I've read too much history. But if I'm going to give the most optimistic voice to this thing, I would say the difference between Oscar Grant and now is twofold. One, we are on the tail of the largest mass movement in American history, and that people are just more attuned cross-racial lines to these issues. And the data that Sarah gave, that's shocking in a good way, that so many people are starting to believe what the data has shown for years. So that may be a difference, that this is the start of more systemic reform. Second, what I think the public is responding to a lot better now, and particularly Black and brown folks across the country, is recognizing that protests alone are not sufficient. And I don't want to just be repetitive of the very significant point that Sarah made before, but I'll point it in a particular direction. People are realizing, and projects are popping up all around the country about knowing your DA. It made a difference that Keith Ellison was the attorney general there. When Tamir Rice was killed years ago and no charges were filed, and people said, what can we do? I said, elect a new DA. That's what you can do, because future cases will be treated differently. We see what's going on in South Carolina. That makes a difference. And communities of color are starting to understand that the most powerful person in the criminal justice system is not the president of the United States. It's not the attorney general, it's your local DA. Like 98% of criminal law happens locally. That's the most important person. And to the extent we are continuing to realize that and are insisting on, we've seen this proliferation now of progressive DAs, Larry Krasner in Philadelphia, Kim Gardner in St. Louis, Kim Fox in Chicago, Rachel Rollins right here in Boston. So, those aspects are different too. Will it be is it enough to make systemic change? Now, this bleeds into your second question. I don't know. I hope so, because I hope that my children won't have to grow up in a world where they're afraid of seeing police officers. I just saw 10 seconds on a parenthetical. Someone sent a video. It was a young black kid, 10 or 11, in his driveway bouncing a basketball. And all of a sudden, that kid retreated and moved behind a car as though he were playing hide and go seek. And then the camera shot showed a police cruiser going down the street. It broke my heart, just broke my heart, because that's just what he felt. I need to just hide for my safety. So I hope my kids don't grow up in that. So I hope these reforms are systemic. But the thrust of your comment/question is absolutely right. One case about holding a police officer accountable is not enough. Whether that's what the message of this case is or not, up to debate. But the larger point is, in addition to that conviction, we need a whole lot more that goes to systemic change. I'll just point out one thing so as not to hog up too much time. And one thing is structural in the law. There's a doctrine in the law, and colloquially we call it would have, could have. That is, the Supreme Court has allowed officers to make stops if there was any objective basis to make that stop, notwithstanding what the officer's subjective intent is. Put differently, an officer could say, I stopped these guys because they were black, but they had one of those fragrant things hanging from their window, so I had a cause to do it. And so the law allows the very sort of interaction between police and citizens that we see, between black and brown citizens, that we see spiral out of control so many times. So that's one aspect that we need to fix. We need to prevent the sort of interactions in so-called high crime neighborhoods that time after time after time after time result in deaths. So there's a way in which the law can be structured that only permits police to do things on the basis of individualized suspicion of a particular crime only, and not skin color as a proxy for criminality, which is the way we police now. And that ends up with a lot of dead black and brown bodies.
Thank you so much, Ron. Yanilda, it's wonderful to see you. It's been months. So share with me your response to this question. What are we to make of this moment? Where is there cause for hope? What should we be concerned about?
Well, first, a huge thank you to Sandra for moderating this conversation. It's really a privilege to be in conversation with Sarah, Ron, and Sandra in this space, and hope that all of our conversations collectively today can kind of lead to much needed change, particularly in this arena of the criminal legal system. I think, like Sarah, I don't work too much in hope, but as somebody who studies policing, particularly in Latin America, but I think I was struck by something that what Ron just said about the young black boy seeing the police in hiding. There's a scholar of policing who said, David Bailey, who said that, what is a way of knowing if you have a democratic police force? And he said, my simple test, sort of wherever you are in the world, you ask a parent and whether when do they tell their children when they are in trouble or they're in danger, they're fearful, do they tell them to go find the police officer? And that is how you can tell whether you have a democratic police force or not. And I think one of the things that we have to come to terms with in this country, and really in many unequal societies around the world, including those that I study and work in, is that in the same country, in the same city, that answer varies greatly depending on things like your race. Primarily in the U.S., your race, your class, perhaps your immigration status, and other characteristics like that, which is antithetical to democracy. So I think that one of the things that I think I'm makes me, I guess, hopeful is that it's not going to sound very hopeful, but that at least people are far more aware that this is a fundamental question of our democracy. That when we talk about the way that police are behaving in our communities, particularly Black communities in this country, is fundamentally antithetical to the promise of democracy, democratic equality, of rights, and all the other protections that we are supposed to all have as members of this polity. So I think that that's actually a real protective element that a lot of people have come to be aware that we don't actually, that this is one area where we don't actually have an equal democracy in this country. And I think that those, as Ron mentioned, that the largest mass movement in the country's history, I think, is a testament to that. I think that sort of all of that happening in the context of the pandemic, which also laid bare the ways that racist structures in this country, and just undergird just about everything. I think it was sort of a master class in structural racism. So by the time the George Floyd video, the video of his death, came across all of our screens, I think people were especially attuned to the fundamental problem. That, and not everyone, but many more people than was the case before, were much more attuned to this question of how structural racism plays out. And it is very much a question of life or death, whether we're talking about COVID or whether we're talking about police violence. And so the reason that makes me hopeful is because it might mean potentially sustaining some of the momentum for change that we're seeing. I'm not willing to say that we've seen change, but the momentum for change that we've been seeing, I think it enables us to think about whether these changes in people's perceptions and preferences and understandings of policing can kind of support the kind of policy reforms that Sarah and Ron were both mentioning. But I'm going to say something slightly different from what they said, which was that, right, so protest is important, but what we need is policy. As somebody sort of who studied police reforms that ultimately are, pretty quickly rolled back, very, very comprehensive, structural, deep police reforms that have been rolled back just about as soon as they were enacted in the case of Colombia and Buenos Aires in Argentina. I would say that we also need more protests, that we need the continuity. Even after you get the policy change, you need to have sustained mobilization, protest or otherwise or other forms to sustain and hold officials accountable, and to remind the rest of the public that this is still a problem. Because what a policy change or a verdict can lead people into the false sense of security that the problem has been fixed. So I think that that's always my concern when I see either a very notable, of course, significant conviction, or a notable change in policy that some people then become susceptible to believing that the problem has been fixed, and then they are less tolerant of sustaining those very reforms. So I'll give you an example of what I mean. In the Ferguson, and then I'll wrap up after this. In the post-Ferguson era, we saw what was called the Ferguson Effect, right? We saw sort of huge increases or notable increases in homicides in cities all over the US. And many commentators were out saying, well, this is because people have been criticizing the police, people have been trying to restrain the police's ability to do their jobs, et cetera, et cetera. So criminals are able to go about, their business and commit these additional acts of violence. And that enabled public opinion to return back to its sense of, oh yes, the police are, they cannot be restrained. These reforms are constraining the police's ability to fight crime and violence, and we need to go back to the way things were before. That's a pattern that I've seen over and over again in the cases of police reform that I study outside of the U.S. in Latin America. And so what makes me worried is that in the past year, since the real awakening that happened post George Floyd, we are seeing once again an increase in homicides in cities around the U.S. And I fear that we're going to see a return to that discourse. It's a very politically attractive and appealing discourse. When we have midterm elections coming up, I suspect and I fear that that is going to be on the agenda once again. There's going to be that kind of counter reform movement, and so this is why it's important to sustain that mobilization that led to the reforms in the again, this momentum for change in the first place.
Well, I'm not sure whether to feel optimistic after your response, Yanilda. But it does remind me that the points that you're making, it does remind me of your terrific first book that came out just a few months ago, Authoritarian Police and Democracy, Contested Security in Latin America. And in this book, you study the persistence of police forces as authoritarian enclaves in otherwise democratic states. And you demonstrate how ordinary democratic politics in unequal societies can both reproduce authoritarian policing and bring about rare moments of expansive reforms. And so your comments are essentially drawing from your base of knowledge. When we chatted about your book a few months back, I asked you to think about what this meant for the US context. And I think in many ways what you just provided was a kind of analysis that's rooted in what you've learned in Latin America. I still want to ask, given the kinds of reforms that are being tossed out across the country with regards to policing, are there places where we can be hopeful? What you're telling me is that change can happen. It could be deeply structural in nature, and yet we could take it back. And as you say that, I think about two things. One, I think about the movements that appear to be afoot in just a few places to transform police departments into departments of public safety. Here, instead of having police who have weapons patrolling the streets, various neighborhoods, we will have kind of civilian type officers. They might be coupled with police, maybe not. The point here is that police are made a little less central to the project of public safety. In other spots, we have conversations about putting into place traffic monitors instead of cops or police officers devoted to that task. We're bringing in crisis management teams that are dealing with. So it makes me wonder, is there, even given what you've said, is there still room to be optimistic about what is possible to the extent that we're trying to kind of disaggregate the police function? We're trying to identify other ways of effectively dealing with some of the social problems that we have without deploying police, which in too many cases leads to very poor outcomes.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Sandra. I'm always again, it'll be a mix of the hopeful and the concerned, as is my trademark. So I write in my work about what I call the structural power of police. The very fact that police control the state's coercive authority, they are the ones in charge of providing order and security. It grants them a great deal of power to be able over politicians and over society, because it's both they're the sort of hired guns of the state, the armed element of the state. They're both a very powerful political tool and a very potent political threat. So they're a tool if they cooperate with the politician. They either enforce your policy of providing security for everybody in a great way, in an equal way, or just providing security for the people that I like and repressing people that I don't like as a political leader. And they're also a potent threat if they withdraw their cooperation, right? So if they sort of, fold their arms and say, well, I'm not going to enforce the law, so you can just let crime run rampant, right? We saw an element of this happen in New York City, the so-called blue flu, right, where officers in New York and NYPD just sort of stopped patrol. They reduced patrols, they reduced arrests. And studies have shown that crime wasn't really affected and might have actually gone down as a result of this. But the political optics of it was that de Blasio was completely lambasted. He was just destroyed in the press and in much of public opinion because of this. So when police don't cooperate with you as a political leader, it's a huge it's a huge threat to your political survival as a politician. So what does this all mean? It means that because police occupy, I'm sorry, I'm hearing an echo on someone's audio. But so when police when police don't cooperate with politicians in this way, it's that big of a threat. So the more space that you give to police in the political system or in society, the more that they build the structural power, the more that they have power over politicians to say, if I withdraw my cooperation in this arena, I'm going to cause chaos. So what has happened in the United States is that the structural power of police, the sort of the arenas in which police act and have authority, has grown, exponentially in recent decades. Whether we're talking about the closing of mental health, centers where people could get support that they needed, and instead we sent police out to respond to mental health crises, to policing in schools, to policing of homelessness, to policing of traffic enforcement. All of those arenas are areas where police can either be a potent political tool for politicians if they cooperate, or a political threat. So that means that what police forces do is that they negotiate this power that they have over all of these arenas into greater autonomy, so that they can act freely, without much in the way of oversight or interference from civilian actors in all of these arenas of life. So what is hopeful in what you've just said, in terms of people seeking to remove police from schools, to reduce police responses in mental health crises, even thinking about rethinking police role in traffic enforcement, drug enforcement, all these different things, it's reducing the police's ability to have this kind of, to pose this kind of threat to politicians and society, of saying, if I don't, cooperate, you all are screwed. So what it does is it reduces the police's ability to, the police's structural power, its ability to extract those concessions and that autonomy from the political leaders who supposedly control them, and the society who they are, purportedly charged with protecting. And so what I think is hopeful is that reducing the footprint of policing in our societies will ultimately, I think, make it easier actually to hold police accountable, because they don't have that, they're not able to exert as much power over political leaders and society in that way. Hopefully that some of that made some sense. But essentially, I think that one thing I'm going to pose to us here, and hopefully in the Q&A, is that I think that that's what the defund movement has really pushed us to debate. I think it's a provocative slogan that has really activated a lot of people, particularly on the right, against it. But ultimately, if you think about what it's calling on us to do, it is that what role do we want the police to have in our society and in our politics? And the more that we reduce that footprint of police, the more that we reduce their power and their ability to act with impunity.
So I'm going to go back to Sara now. We've spoken about the importance of protest and what impact that has on moving the conversation forward. The news media play a huge role. This is the fourth estate. Without the news media, we can't have a thriving democracy. And as I think about this, I think about the way in which, in some ways, the news media itself has been a part of the politics around this, right? So the people on the far right, we don't want you here, police don't want you here. And maybe perhaps more recently, I saw a video where a Black man confronted you in Minneapolis and said something along the lines of, all the press and the shit y'all do makes matters worse, or makes this worse, right? And pointing to the protests. Talk to us, Sara, about the importance of journalism in terms of covering these protests, and also how coverage of the protests themselves, especially those related to racial justice, how this coverage has changed over the years. It seems like there's been a move. Can you tell us about that?
I think that there has been a couple of things. I'll talk about what I see as the importance of the journalists who go out to cover these stories, the importance of putting it at a high level in some of the first things that you will see in the headlines of the news. A lot of people argue, and that gentleman that came up to me was angry, and I understood. And people were saying to me, wow, I mean, why didn't you just go back at him? I said, why? The man is going through something. He has a certain feeling about the way this is happening, and he feels that us being there gins people up. My response to that was, though, that people say, well, if the cameras weren't here, I hear this all the time. If the cameras weren't here, this wouldn't be happening. And I'm going to cuss because I call bullshit on that. That is not where we are in this nation right now, and not where we are in this world. Everyone has their own TV station. Everyone. Social media, right? And some of the stories that we get to this day are because someone, a young woman of 17 years old, decided that what she was seeing was wrong, and she held that camera the whole time, putting herself in a precarious position, but she did not stop because she saw something that she just knew was wrong, and this was her way of doing something about it. So the idea that we are somehow ginning things up and creating the situation, I push back on. I think what we have to do, though, is be far deeper in our coverage. In other words, when the protests are happening and things are starting to go off the rails, if you will, people's anger is exploding. It turns into people, taking it out, whether it be on the police officers that are near them or on the buildings that are near them. And sometimes I think in the past it's been like, oh, violence is happening. Okay, well, now you get what you get. You deserve what you get. You can't just do this, right? I think what has changed is that there has been a recognition by many folks, people of color in particular, reporters of color in particular, who know that the rage comes from a place of sorrow. It's not just rage. This comes from a place of sorrow and helplessness because of the interactions that people have had, not that day, but over time, and how they have been treated. And so we speak that now. Whereas before, you were literally just talking about, okay, now this building is burning. Okay, now that building is being looted, and then this is happening. And it was very facts first and no context. Now it's facts coupled with context. You cannot have one without the other. And I think that's a realization that I have seen happening more and more and more now, even in my own reporting, where I have to then say, wait a minute, you are seeing some of this, not because that person wants to create havoc, but because they don't feel anyone is listening. And this is the way. And guess what? You're listening now, aren't you? It is unfortunate because the activists on the ground who have been there long before we ever showed up, long before anyone ever heard of, George Floyd or Minneapolis, long before people knew what the situation was with police versus Black people in that community. It's been a long, hard situation. The police chief himself sued the police department years prior because of discrimination of the Black officers that existed in that space then. So this is not a new story, but what you are seeing is more context, and you're hearing hearing more from the activists. And I seek out people who I know are from the community when I'm out there reporting, not just people who have come in to support them. I seek them out. I try to find who those people who have been change makers in the community before all of this. And they will say, look, please don't burn down our grocery store. Please don't go in and tear up if you can, please, because next day, next week, next month, my mother needs to be able to get to the store and be able to do her shopping. We need to be able to heal from this, and this will make this healing take a very long time. And so we have to get more voices out there, I think. Sometimes the reaction is just get the crazy, just be there for the crazy, because people watch that and they are attracted to that. And they are. The numbers bear that out. They complain about it, but they're attracted to it. But we have to, while doing that, also explain and go deeper and talk to the people who really have been pushing for real change. And I just want to read you just a small thing that has happened that I thought was extraordinary and really, really different and interesting. And that is that in George Floyd Square, and this is the place that has been kept for more than a year by activists and some members of the neighborhood, that has been kept as a memorial to George Floyd and to others. And what they have done, and it has been controversial because they have blocked off 4 roads in that neighborhood surrounding where George Floyd died outside of Cup Foods. But what they have done is asked for 24 things to change before the roads are open. And they say no justice, no streets is the moniker that has been placed all over the place. And I found what was extraordinary is that, yes, they talked about, ending qualified immunity and asking to ban the indemnification of law enforcement officers and to look into some other cases that they felt were unjust. But one of the things as you go down this list of 24 demands that I thought, now this is starting to get into our societal issues. They said things like allocate funds for integrative health services in and around our neighborhood. Establish something so that we as businesses in this neighborhood can rise and do better. Grant us money, give grants to those businesses who have stayed here and suffered through this so that they can attract more people to the neighborhood and so that they can create jobs in the neighborhood. Allocate money to replenish and refurbish what has been destroyed in the community during some of these protests. And so to watch that, put a moratorium, for example, on property tax increases for the residents in the area that have been dealing with this for many, many, many months because we have hardships too. And when I looked at that, I thought, these are young people who are so thoughtful and who are now looking at this holistically. They don't just see that police are the problem in their minds. They see that there is a societal issue and that until those issues, healthcare and jobs and property taxes and grants for businesses, until those things are looked at as well, that this problem is likely going to come back. And so they're looking for some different ways to try to engage the city with them to try and make lasting change. And I felt that was a really hopeful moment, seeing those written out on what was I think it was a dumpster at one point, and around that square. The young people have done some thinking, and it is really fascinating to see what they're asking for.
I really appreciate that. So I do need to go to the audience for Q&A, but Ron, I can't go before I ask you one final question, and that is this. For many, the criminal legal system is an institution of racial domination. And it's part of a larger kind of genealogy, right? So we move from slavery ends, we go to Jim Crow ends, we go to hypersegregation. Well, who knows I don't know that has ended, but we've then moved on to mass incarceration, right? So with the end of one, another emerges seemingly to take its place. And we are here in part to talk about the abolition of the carceral state and the possibilities that abolishing the police or substantially changing it might make a difference. From one race scholar, race theorist to another, what impact truly will the abolition of the carceral state have for really kind of dismantling the racial hierarchy that has existed in this country from the moment of its existence, maybe even before that, till now? You have 2 minutes. I'm just joking.
Sorry, I keep forgetting to unmute. I'll keep it short, about 2 minutes until audience time. Okay, so I was saying, phrased thusly, probably no impact at all. The history embedded in your question suggests that we are doomed to some other form. And when I was a youngster many moons ago and started at the Harvard Law School, the great Derek Bell told us that racism is intractable in this country. Your victory is in the fight. Which to 22, 23-year-olds, I think I'm 26 now, is it just seems so penultimate. It's a hard pill to swallow, and I haven't quite swallowed that pill yet. It is going to be difficult. Everything you said is correct. Yes, I will suggest something James Baldwin said. The history of Blacks in America has been the history of making the impossible possible. And so one thing I think that we have to do, to the extent that we think that we can break this system, I am thankful to the young people for pushing people like me to think about forms of abolition as opposed to reform. I mean, Angela Davis posed the question in the 70s, but these young people are really like, no, your reformist attitude is going to lead to another instantiation of it in the way that you suggested. We need to start over. And maybe that's the answer. I'm not quite there yet, I must admit. But you know, your history is spot on. And maybe we do need to just rethink some of these systems from the ground up in order to affect some systemic and long-term change. That was 1:40 seconds.
That was amazing. So I'm going to let the audience have their turn with each of you. I'm not exactly sure how this will work, but I'm sure someone will take over at this point. Thank you all so much for terrific responses, very thoughtful. I appreciate it very much.
Hello all, and thank you so much for an incredible panel so far, so rich and so powerful. I am here to ask questions coming from our audience to you all. And first off, a question from the audience for all of you. The people watching the panel right now would love to know, what are the levers and the tactics that we should be considering to move public awareness forward and scale proven alternative models broadly? And a kind of sub-question in that is, what role the media and educational institutions can play in pursuing this change and moving public willingness forward?
Ron, do you want to? I can answer the media question. I'll do the second part.
Sure, but actually, Professor Gonzalez didn't get a second shot.
That is true.
Do you want to start off and then we can pick back up?
Sure. So the question is sort of about levers of change that folks can think about. I mean, I think sort of going back to what I was saying in terms of how do you sustain the momentum for change that we've been seeing with respect to, for example, the changes to policing that have been adopted by the state of Maryland or by in New York City or in cities throughout the U.S., including reducing the as I was saying, the footprint of police in areas such as traffic enforcement or mental health crises, et cetera. And I think that a really important lever of change that I think is something that failed to emerge in the cases that I've studied, the places that I research, is really a sustained movement that seeks to change public opinion, that seeks to sort of continuously educate the public about disparities in policing, about abuses in policing, about including even alternatives to policing. Because I think that one of the things that happens when a case sort of exceptional only in the sense of people finding out about it, not exceptional in the case of it happening rarely, but when exceptional moments like the George Floyd case, and again, exceptional only in the sense that we were all attuned to it and paying attention to it, not exceptional in any way suggesting that it doesn't happen literally every day. Those are moments of public education, of public awareness, of a kind of what I call a converging of people's ideas, of people's attitudes toward policing, toward a sense that something needs to change, that something needs to be done. And so I think that a really important role for the young folks that are watching us, the students, activists, advocates, educators, journalists, everyone all around, is keeping that moment of education going and awareness going constantly and consistently after the victory of a conviction or of a law being passed. Because what ends up happening is that progress that is made in people understanding, okay, the poll numbers that were cited before, right? 60% of Americans, 60 to 70% of Americans thinking that policing is racialized and that police abuses disproportionately affect Black people, as occurred during the summer, returning to something like a 25% of white people thinking that only 25% of white people thinking that the police behave in racially disparate ways. The way to prevent that from happening is through this consistent action this consistent sort of, sort of lifting of the veil in a certain way of this sort of, this is a routine way that police act throughout this country and really in many places of the world where we have highly unequal societies. And so I think that a really important lever is to keep that going, and not only during these moments of, exceptional moments when everybody's eyes and ears are attuned to this problem. And I think that it's only through that constant work that we're going to sustain, as I said, the policies and the other changes that may eventually occur. So that's why I was saying before that the protests and the policy have to sustain each other. It's not just the policy follows protest. Protest has to continue to follow policy change. Even the election of a progressive prosecutor, which I know, has to be, that pressure has to be sustained on them as well. With all due respect to all of them, that pressure has to be sustained, because you can bet for sure that they're getting pressure from the police and from other political sectors. And so if they don't feel that pressure coming from the sectors that are demanding change, we're going to see a return to the previous status quo.
So I'll jump in next and just say a word or two here. So in terms of what can sort of the levers that can be used to continue to change public perception, I think the gift of the cell phone has been, Sarah held it up earlier, has been sort of the greatest gift that this movement could have had, because it puts plainly on display the facts. You can't argue it. And when you sort of look at the way that people write up these reports versus what you see on video, you know why that video is so important. So, this technology allows us to now have the body worn cameras and so forth, and people can begin to see with their own eyes. My particular focus, though, tends to be on a smaller subset of folks who can really make policy changes and changes in law. I tend not to focus much, nor have a lot of faith in the hearts and minds side of the issue, changing hearts and minds. I think the law can change behavior. You may not like me, I could care less, but if I want to buy a house here, you can't stop me. You must sell it to me. That's how I believe. Professor Brooks, he's one of my idols and one of the people, he deals with the hearts and minds and souls of folks. I deal with the law that enjoins people to do something or not do something, or you go to jail. And to the extent that, and that's just one part of it, there are other parts of it. And to the extent that I can massage that part of it sufficiently such that the distributions of burdens and benefits of the society don't disproportionately, the negative parts of it don't disproportionately fall on the shoulders of Black and brown people, then, I think I've done my little piece of the job here. So I'll flip it over to Sarah for the media part of that question. You're on mute still.
I'm just following in your footsteps, Professor. Now I'm doing it. I've thought a lot about this question because we are in a scenario. We are taught to show what is happening in a country, a city, a state, a community, and I think all news is local. I know they say all politics is local. I think all news is local. In that, in each place that you may be, other localities are likely experiencing something similar. It's just that you're not in their city. And one of the things that gets our attention, and people can criticize this all day long, but one of the things that gets the attention of journalists and the media as a whole are protests. They are actions. They are unusual things that may arise. Unusual cases that may arise. And our role really is to examine. We should be examining and let the public see to the best of our knowledge, the truth or as many different parts of what is going on at once, and giving voice to those who really have something that they need to share with the rest of society because they feel it needs to change. And it needs to change. I mean, there are some things that are just plain and simple and factual that just need to change. And the outcry, when it is large, especially, gets our attention. So when you talk about protests, and when I said, like policy kind of keeps things for a longer period of time, as long as those policies are followed and enforced, which is a whole nother thing that I'm sure Yanilda can speak better to. But if you completely walk away from it, I mean, I think that's what we saw between, 1975 and 2000 and, whatever. I mean, or 1992 when Rodney King was shown, beaten in the streets over and over again. And those officers were acquitted by a jury in Simi Valley, not even where the beating took place. And there was a reaction to that, and that sort of sparked something. But it really did get back going to me in 2020, a year that forced us all to examine what the hell we were doing, particularly with the Black community, but in America as a whole because of coronavirus and how we were treating one another and handling things. And all of our focus went to some of the ills of our country because we're forced to look at it. We were stuck in our homes. We had no distractions. We were watching, whether it be our phones or whether it be our televisions and our computers. So I do think there is a role to play in the sense that when there are things going on in a community that you feel as activists and as residents, I think sometimes we use the word activist, and really these are neighbors and residents of a place who have taken a role to speak up because maybe they have the time, or maybe they just have this passion that they feel they need to speak up for many other people. And to get to us, the phone works real well. Videos work real well. You can get to us in many different ways, but I do think that we also must be held accountable. We also, and we are challenged, in person. The conversation I had with that gentleman that was live, everyone took this, clutch their pearls, oh, what happened? That guy just came up and he started screaming at you and cussing at you. And I said, that just happened to be caught on camera. That happens to me on a regular basis. I have these conversations and I treat someone on camera the same as I would in the background. I say, look, man, this is your platform. Say what you need to say. What is deeply bothering you? And so we have to be more open to criticism. But we also have to be more open to the stories when things are not exploding, because the explosion happens when something has just gone completely off the rails and people are just up to here. There are lots of things going on in the background, in the calm, in the quiet, that I think also deserves attention. And many of us reporters fight for that. And it's difficult. It's difficult to get that on television. It's difficult to get that in a written form. Ask any reporter anywhere. The news cycle is very fast. And I think we've all had to run too fast, where there's not a lot of time to think, which is why people who write books, Yanilda, are very important, right? Because they can synthesize and give you a better look at, a deeper look at what happens. You cannot expect the media, just like you cannot expect the police, to cure the ills of the country, but you can expect them to be respectful, accurate, honest about the way they're going about doing their jobs, and hold them accountable. And I think that the young people actually have done a really good job of that. Social media has been one of the venues in which people have been able to come and say, I don't like the way you wrote that headline. Now, I'm not always going to agree with you. So, just know that. But I am going to listen, and I'm going to consider it. Whether I've written you back or not, I am going to consider that maybe that wasn't the right thing to do. And if I think it wasn't the right thing to do, I will have it changed. I will say to my editors, you know what? The way I wrote that sentence it wasn't right. It needs some help. And I've actually had that happen. Conversely, I have argued over a headline that I didn't write, but it was on my story, and I took full accountability for it. And I said, you know what, I'm not changing that because I want to do this story this way, and I think that headline is fine. But I do think you all, as a group of people who want to make sure things are accurate and fair, you have a venue now that you never had before, and that is social media. And as much as I sometimes cannot stand it, and it can be so oppressive sometimes, that is one of the ways that works. I'm just putting it out there.
Thank you all so much for your candor and for your fresh and very much needed perspectives. I especially want to lift up what you just mentioned about there being between residents and activists, because that's really what we're trying to do with this convening. We're trying to show that everyone has the ability to be an activist if they only have something that they are passionate about and a social justice issue they wish to fight for. So thank you so much for raising that point. Many other questions from the audience that we have that we'd love to work through. So the next question I have for you all is doubling back to a topic that was mentioned earlier in the panel when we were talking about the Ferguson Effect. One of our audience members would love to know, what is effective messaging to mitigate the Ferguson Effect, specifically the changes it brings about to public opinion?
I think that is the $1 million question. And I think that this is a problem of progressive politics and pro human rights based activists, not only in the U.S. But really around the world, which is sort of what does a different vision of safety and security look like? The sort of law and order buzzword that emerged, particularly sort of post in the 1960s and 1970s. Work by Veshla Weaver, really documents very nicely how people were talking about law and order with justice. Sort of the Democrats are trying to make that a thing, and it didn't become a thing, right? Law and order with justice just never really took off in the way that law and order did. So it's I think a challenge for folks who want to see either reform or abolition, who just want to see something different, who want to see policing fundamentally change. To come up with what is an alternative rights-based vision of safety and security that either involves a different vision of policing or no vision of policing. Because I think that is, and this is something that I found throughout my research throughout Latin America and in the United States. This is a huge gap, whether we're talking about left parties, progressive parties, human rights activists. Folks don't have an alternative, quick, catchy way of conveying to people that there are alternative ways of getting a safety that don't run through law and order, or in the Latin American context, mano dura. And so I think that is, I'll leave it to sort of others who are more expert in messaging, perhaps Sarah, sort of communications in terms of what would be a more effective alternative messaging. But I think that fundamentally, suggesting to people that actually police violence, a violent police force, does not actually create more safety. It's sort of, I think we can sort of look to many contexts and say that the police, that sort of high levels of police violence and high levels of sort of societal violence tend to go hand in hand. And so you don't actually get more peace by militarizing, you don't get more safety by militarizing the police, that we sort of have evidence of that from around the world. And so I think that sort of, again, this sort of constant public education work that activists, advocates, educators, media have to do to sort of say, I understand that you don't feel safe and you want something to be done, but actually a more violent police, a militarized police does not actually make our society safer. It does not actually reduce violence. It actually increases levels of violence. And there's lots of different research showing that. So I think, a catchy phrase is not going to be easily defeated by research and statistics and here's the data. But I think that working with that for folks who do have that skill set, I think is going to be fundamental to sort of say, and just generally a different vision of safety that is anchored in human rights, that is anchored in social justice. Because I think that the trade-off that the law and order folks want you to believe is that this is the only way to achieve safety. So I think the effective way to rebut it is to say there's alternative visions that we can collectively construct about what safety looks like. So I think that that's what I would add, but I'll maybe leave it to Sara to think about what would be more effective in terms of messaging and communication strategy.
I'm not good at this because I'm used to trying to get behind the messaging and find out what's really going on. Because, the names of bills, I mean, I know you all can speak to this, this sort of names of bills are the perfect messaging tool. And half the time, the actual legislation is the opposite, or does the opposite, or achieves the opposite, depending on who wrote the bill. And so if it was an industry that wrote it and it says, safer cars, then you find out, actually this isn't making anything safer. But I will say this. When you talk about policing and you talk about alternatives to policing, one of the things, and you touched on this, Yanilda, when people say defund the police, boy, does that spark a reaction, right? And whether good or bad, right? It's for some people, they go, "Oh, what does that mean?" And there are a lot of folks and police officers who I've known for years, and I asked them about this. I mean, it was guttural. It was like, if you take away our budgets, we won't be able to do anything, and you guys are just going to have rampant crime. You're just good. You do what you got to do. Like, okay, if that's what you want. I mean, the reaction to it was visceral. However, because it created that, it did spark people to say, what is this? What do you actually mean by that? What do you actually mean? And there was an incredible moment. I was in a church on Sunday, the Sunday before the trial began. The Floyd family was there in Minneapolis. I went on my own time to see, sort of what the community was doing, and then we decided, okay, let's bring a camera. But I was sort of there. I wasn't in my reporting capacity the whole time. And there was a moment where the pastor stood up and he said, we need our police. He's like, I am talking to mothers whose kids have been shot in the streets. And we've seen this murder rate go up during the pandemic for whatever reason, desperation, whatever reason. And we need our police. And then someone in the back pews said, we don't just want to defund the police. We want to abolish police. And there was this moment at which I watched this two people from the community who obviously care deeply about the place in which they live and the people which they live with and around, having a really strong conversation in a church, with dozens of people, and the Floyd family there. And so it is really the messaging, I think, you almost have to stop worrying so much about the messaging and finding the solutions, finding the way in which you want the change to happen. Because when you say to someone, why don't we have counselors go along with police? Or why don't we have a team of counselors who are the initial contact when there is a mental health call go out? And when you say that, people go, well, that's not kind of a bad idea. I've had a police officer say that to me. That's not a bad idea, because half the time we don't know what to do. We don't know what this person is suffering from. And so if you can get the message out and the solution out, that is a better way to get people to go, huh? I mean, if you're going to pay counselors to go out there to do this work, to calm the situation down, you may not need a police officer to come out at all. This may be the path. And if we're funding that, okay, that lets the police officers deal with whatever issues, if you still, are into having that sort of setting, if you're still into having police in your communities and you think that they are a good part of the community, which, by the way, many Black folks do. They do. I've seen the arguments over and over again where they say, I want policing to be fair. I do not want this racist part of this to exist. But there are times when I myself, and I'm not talking about me, but the people I'm talking to, have had to call the police. I needed help. I had no other option. But mental health is one of those things that over and over and over and over again, mistakes are made because the police don't have the skill or the training to deal with it. And counselors have that training. So if you took some money and put that in a pot and said, hey, this is what we're doing. So I think the messaging, there has to be some solutions in the messaging, or people are going to react and not even care what comes after that. And I have seen this happen over and over and over again. So, the chants that happen are very effective. People remember those. You hear them over and over and over again. People remember those. But there has to be something that is solid underneath that, where you are actually looking at solutions and not just raging against the machine. Because when people get tired of the rage, I know we're all tired, right? Because we feel it too. But the messaging underneath of that and thinking there is a solution, this could be a real solution to this. It gives that spark of hope in that rage to say, all right, let's put our energy towards that. And the media will follow. Trust me, that if that becomes a thing in a city somewhere here in Los Angeles, there's a lot of movement for that. If that becomes a policy somewhere, we will go to that story and see how it's working. We will go with those counselors and see what they're doing. And that brings that story out to the rest of the country. Like, look at what they're doing in Minneapolis. Look at what they're doing in LA. This is a new thing they're trying. Let's see how this works. That can be very powerful. And then social media as well, grabbing onto, hey, did you see this? These are counselors that have gone out to XYZ homes and brought the temperature down, and they actually helped this person get through their crisis, or this family. Those can be very powerful, powerful images and powerful messages that work.
Briefly, in 2007, then candidate Barack Obama suggested that we be smart on crime instead of tough on crime. The country was decidedly not ready for that then and wanted to remain tough on crime. 15 years later, and in the wake of the George Floyd trial, perhaps smart on crime could be a good slogan that stands as a proxy for all the things that my two colleagues just suggested.
Fantastic. Thank you all so much. Oh, Sarah, your camera's on mute.
I mean, I think you just came up with a genius idea, Ron, because that's the kind of thinking where when people hear that, it doesn't create a gut punch. It's like, yeah, work smarter, not harder. Like, we all know that, right? I don't do it. I still work harder, not smarter half the time. But those kind of ideas and coming together as a community and looking at those things, man, that's great.
Yes, truly a fantastic session where we're getting everyone's point of view. Thank you all so much for answering that question and providing us all something to think about and how we can work a bit smarter towards these issues. Because you guys are so intelligent and so impactful in your words, we have some more questions left from the audience. The next one we want to ask you guys is, how do you create a sense of urgency for reforms that would reduce lengthy sentences and provide more opportunities for early release from prison? This audience member is concerned that about how to create urgency when it would just be easier for legislatures to leave things as they are than to make change.
Well, if I can start, one of the things we might think about is convergence theory, where interests converge. So progressives want lighter sentences. They want release for reasons, for dignitary reasons having to do with the dignity of the individuals. It's also extraordinarily expensive to house people. It costs jurisdictions a lot of money, and there's no debate in the social scientists on the following proposition that after a certain amount of time, increased incarceration has a criminogenic impact. Criminogenic is a term that criminologists use that just means you get worse after a certain amount of time. These individuals will come back into the community, and it's a even bigger problem. Here you have a convergence of interests. Fiscal conservatives can say, hey, look, we're saving money. by creating programs to release folks, and liberals and progressives can say we're doing the right thing by getting people out. So in terms of creating a sense of urgency, that I think that shrewd policy makers can articulate a narrative that can appeal to both sides and get it done. And we actually saw this happen. This isn't just me with random theorization about it. We saw it happen in major cities across the country, and California is probably the most significant example. There was a time period, maybe 10 years ago or so, when California prisons were bursting, and you would see these celebrities get arrested and convicted. They would say 6 months, and in 2 days they were out. It's not because they were getting special treatment. It's because that is what was happening in California, because it was just too full. And there was convergence of interest. People like me who don't think we ought to be throwing people in cages. I'm happy because people are getting out, and folks who are worried about tax bases and those sorts of things, they're happy because, we're not spending X amount of dollars a year on, nonviolent misdemeanors and so forth. So that's one way, briefly.
Can I just piggyback off of Ron's comment and say, even as we release, we should not replace that with other systems of heavy surveillance, which is what is happening in many places across the country. So for instance, as San Francisco moved into reforming their bail system, they released many people now instead of holding them pre-trial. And then they hold them there's court-ordered electronic monitoring. Essentially, that means that people are being tracked wherever they go. Now, we know that even without tracking, people tend to show up to their court hearings. They tend not to have new criminal complaints brought against them while undergoing pretrial. It's not quite clear it's necessary for the overwhelming majority of people to be tracked in this way. But in many cases, this is what is happening. They replace one form of surveillance, one form of containment with another. And we don't want people to leave jail or prison only to be incarcerated in their own homes. And it also comes with other issues, including fines, fees, surcharges that are related to the costs of being monitored. Those costs are often borne. This is not the case in San Francisco, but they're often borne by the people who must wear those shackles, who must wear those monitors. So we both want to think in terms of a kind of liberation from jails and prisons, but also liberation on the outside. There has to be real reason to surveil people in the way that we do. Otherwise, we will continue to reproduce very problematic outcomes, and in ways that do a complete disservice to the individuals and the families and communities that have to deal with this. And that also reproduces these disadvantages. So let's keep that in mind as we're thinking about abolishing prisons and jails, or reducing the numbers of folks that we're holding.
Just very briefly, since definitely, there's other folks in this panel who are much more experienced in the issue of sort of the criminal legal system in its mass incarceration component. But one thing that I would say that has to happen, is sort of indispensable for changing the nature of this debate, is centering the voices of people who are currently incarcerated and people who have been formerly incarcerated. I mean, I think that those of us that are in educational institutions, Sarah, in the case of being in the media, and many others from whatever standpoint we have, where we are in communication with others and trying to educate others about what's going on, it's really essential that we give space and share power with people who have been affected by these systems. Sort of in my own work, I make sure that family members of victims of police violence are central to the work that I'm doing. And so I think that centering their voices to really hear about what's going on, and also just in the face of a society that dehumanizes people that are locked up, I think it's really essential to have their voices front and center, to really, let the rest of society in on what's going on behind bars, and what life is like once folks are out. And I think that will very slowly perhaps, but I think it can counter to the urgency, piece of the question. I think it's essential to start changing people's perspectives on our incarceration and what our prisons are actually doing.
And just a couple of things here. I have folks in my family that are in the criminal justice realm, and it is interesting to see, and I'm going to go back to mental illness or mental health issues, because one thing that I know that people see in the prosecution side of all this is that when it comes to misdemeanors, and California has changed quite a bit in some of the new laws that have been put in place, where some of the things that were felonies are now misdemeanors, and now those things are getting pushed down into trying to do programs and trying to offer services. And one thing that has happened over and over again is that there is a small number of people who have the tendency to relapse and continue to be brought back in over and over and over. I think the number is 9% or 10%. It's something. It's a small group. And one of the things that has struggled with so much is that when it comes to mental illness, homelessness, for example, or houselessness, that many times those folks will not participate in some of the different programs that are available. And so they don't get the help that they need. They end up sort of on this cycle. And I have always wondered how to deal with that. I don't know what the answer is. I think that they have figured out that incarcerating folks, for small things, it doesn't work, because there are some folks that really do need some help in trying to just live their daily lives. They have gone through many traumas, and they're not there yet. You can't make someone who is addicted to something, come to the table if they're just not ready. And so I think that's something that people struggle with on the prosecutorial side of this, and a frustration on the side of this that I have heard myself from several different prosecutors. But I do think that in the end, when you talk about putting someone away for so long, that again, they're now learning more criminal behavior and being around people who are also in that space, and it makes it more normalized for them, so that when they come out, they have paid their debt to society, and society will not open that door. Society will not say, okay, you paid your debt. Okay, let's get you a job. Let's get you. Society closes, still to this day, closes in and keeps you out of being able to take part in everyday life. And for that, I think we are paying the price for that, for not being able to see someone. We all say, okay, someone has paid their debt, whatever that is. But when they come out, their debt grows. Right? What do you do? And so I struggle with that a lot as a reporter, reporting some of these stories out. You go into someone's background and you see that they've been through and gone through this process many different times, and sometimes know the laws better than the prosecutors and the defense attorneys that they're dealing with. How do you affect change there? That's something that our society is going to have to deal with, and I am not sure. I am not equipped, certainly as a reporter, to deal with it, but something I've been very curious about, and maybe Professor Sullivan can talk about it.
Well, I think our time is almost up, and that probably saves me from the hardest question of the day that Sarah just posed. But I think that's right. The issue is that it is multifaceted, and this notion of race insinuates itself into all aspects of our lives. We shouldn't be surprised that it's front and center in the carceral state as well.
Thank you all so much for offering your insight on these questions. As Professor Sullivan just mentioned, we are about out of time, so I turn it over to Sandra to finish us out for this panel.
Well, All I have to say at this moment is thank you, Ron Sullivan. Thank you, Sara Sidner. Thank you, Yanilda González, for just a wonderful conversation. So incredibly insightful. People who are coming in with incredible intelligence around this topic from very different perspectives that allow us to really have a rich discussion. I'm not sure that we could have had such a rich discussion without you all. Thank you so much for being a part of this, and we really do hope to stay in touch.